action. All right, you guys, Mr. Medine here, Mr. M. We're gonna be doing a quick video on the 15% rule. I don't know what it is about the 15% rule, but sometimes when we don't get it, we don't get it. But when we get it, we get it. So we're gonna be doing the 15% rule, so let's go ahead and get started. So the 15% rule has to do with changes in kV. So changes in kV. So sometimes I'll ask you which prime exposure factor, would be applicable to the 15% rule. It's going to be kV. So changes in kV, and obviously it's by 15%, correct? So when you go up in kV by 15%, what's going to happen is you're going to double your exposure. You're doubling the recorded IR exposure. So let's say you have an image that's underexposed, it's non-diagnostic, you're already tapping out the max already for the mass, and you don't want to go up more in mass, you can go up in kV if you can. So what you would do is you'd increase your kV by 15%. So the opposite is true as well. If you go down in kV by 15%, well then you're going to half your recorded exposure. So this is what we need to understand first before we start messing with mass and time and all that. So you want to make sure you understand this first before we go into the next step. All right, so you understand this part here? Okay. All right, so now let me give you an example of how this is going to work. So let's say this is the body part. You make an exposure at 60 kV. And now you're going to go ahead and I'll get my calculator out. You have X-ray photons going to the part, and let's say 2 photons go through. All right. Now, if you go to 15% more, so let's say we increase it by 15%, we're going to go ahead and go here to 60 plus 15% is 9. So now we're at 69 kV. Well, we're going to round it. We're going to go to 70 kV. So now let's say we have these photons coming into the body, but this time we have twice the amount of photons going through. So I'm just using these hypothetically, of course, but you're going to have twice the amount of photons going through the object because you're increasing the force, you're increasing the power, the force of the X-ray, the energy, the quality of the energy is getting stronger. So you're having more X-rays go through the object. So this is what's happening with the 15% rule. So a lot of people struggle with this, but you're not going to be one of them because you're going to get it after you watch this. So if they ask for a similar exposure after making a change, well then that's when you mess with the mass, all right? So if they ask a question, they say, you know what? If there's an increase of kV and they want a similar exposure, then we're going to have to mess with the mass. So I'm going to go ahead and erase this here. Just try to not get that off. All right. So now let's say you go 60 kV at 5 mass. And you have, let's say, 2 X-rays go through. And of course, this is all hypothetical. Now you go up to 70 kV, but they're saying they want a similar exposure, they want the same exposure that's going to be recorded. Well, because you're going up in force, you can cut down on the quantity. All right, so you're going up in force, you're going to come down in the quantity of the X-ray, so you're going to come down in the mass. So exactly by how much? You're going to cut it in half. So if you go up by 15% and they want the similar exposure, then we're going to half the mass. So if you do it another projection at 70 kV at 2.5 mass, for this example, well then guess what? You're going to have the same amount of X-rays go through. So you're going to get a similar exposure, right? So only when they ask for a similar or same recorded exposure, all right? So you can also do this with MA or time. So let's say they give you just the MA only. So if you have 60 kV at 100 MA, well, it's going to be the same thing. You have an increase of 15%, right? So we're going to half the mass, but they didn't give us the mass, they only gave us the MA. That's okay. We're going to go ahead and just plug in, 50 MA. All right, does that make sense? So if they give us the time, let's say they gave us, let's say 1 second. Well, over here, it'd be half a second. So again, every time you go up by 15%, and they're asking you to keep the exposure the same, then you're gonna half the mass. But this time, they didn't give us the mass, they just gave us the time. We can still plug that in. Does that make sense? All right, so let's do one that's gonna be the opposite now. All right. Let's go backwards, but this time, I'll say we start with 80 kV. All right, and you're gonna go down by 15%. Oops. You're gonna go down by 15%. So if we do that, it's gonna be 70 kV. All right, so if we're using 80 kV at 4 mass, and we're taking an X-ray, and now you're cutting your kVp down by 15%, and if they want to keep it the same, well then guess what we have to do? We have to double the mass. You're going to have to double the quantity. Because you're taking away some of the force, you're going to have to supplement that with more quantity, more mass. So we're going to double the mass. So if we use 4 mass here at 80 kV, well then we would use 70 kV at 8 mass. And you'd get the same amount of exposure that's going through the object. All right, so somebody asked me a good question. Mr. M, you know, when is this applicable? Well, if you had a patient that you had to make sure that we should always be using optimum kVp, right? But let's say you want to go ahead and go down in your mass, all right? And you still want to get the same exposure. You want to cut the dose down. Let's say this patient's a chemotherapy patient or whatever it may be. You can go ahead and apply the 15% rule. The other thing that we can go ahead and do is mess around with the grayscale. So it's not as prevalent now as it was before with film, but again, you can go ahead and get a longer grayscale with 80 kV compared to 70 kV. It's going to be a longer scale of contrast, lower contrast with higher kV. So let's say you want to get more of the bicep, you know, instead of the bone of the humerus. Well, then you can go ahead and do 80 kV at 4 mass instead of 70 kV at 8 mass. I don't know if that makes sense. I hope it does. So, but this is the 15% rule. And again, don't make it complicated. And just remember that other techs have learned it before you, and you can do it too, okay? They're no better than you, okay? You're just as special, all right? So I'm hoping this helps you, all right? And I look forward to your comments and questions. Hello everyone, you guys. Thank you very much for watching the videos. I'm hoping that they're helping you out. Please make sure that you subscribe and that you hit the notification bell to be notified about new videos. Again, remember to be good to yourself and be good to others. Thank you.